Baby discovered a bear cub trapped in a hotel room closet. What he did next shocked security. The mountain air carried something different that evening, something Ethan Marshall couldn't quite place as he guided their rental car up the winding road toward the Whispering Pines Lodge. Jessica sat beside him, their 18-month-old son Leo sleeping peacefully in his car seat, tiny fingers still clutching his favorite stuffed bear that went everywhere with him. The lodge appeared through the trees like something from a dream, all warm, golden lights against the darkening sky, wooden beams that seemed to have grown from the mountain itself rather than been built there. They had chosen this place specifically for its isolation, nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies where cell phone signals barely reached, and the nearest town was an hour's drive through forest roads that twisted like ribbons through the wilderness. The check-in process was smooth and quiet, the lobby filled with the comforting crackle of a massive stone fireplace and the subtle scent of cedar and pine that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves. Their room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long hallway where thick carpet muffled every footstep, and the windows looked out onto an endless sea of evergreen trees that stretched toward peaks still capped with early autumn snow. Leo woke as they entered the room, his eyes wide with wonder at the new surroundings. And Jessica set him down to explore, while she and Ethan began unpacking their bags. The suite was spacious and elegant, with rustic furniture that looked handcrafted, and a stone fireplace that matched the one in the lobby below. Everything about the space whispered comfort and safety, from the thick quilts on the king-sized bed to the deep armchairs, positioned perfectly for watching the sunset through floor-to-ceiling windows. Leo toddled around the room, investigating every corner with the serious concentration only toddlers possess, his little hands touching the smooth wood of the coffee table, the soft fabric of the curtains, the cool glass of the windows, where his breath made small clouds of fog. The closet door stood slightly ajar at the far end of the room, one of those walk-in types with heavy wooden doors that looked like they belonged in a cabin from another century. Jessica noticed Leo heading toward it and started to follow, but Ethan called her over to help with something in their suitcase, and in that brief moment of distraction, their son disappeared into the shadows of the closet. The silence that followed was not the alarming kind that makes parents' hearts race, but rather a curious quiet that seemed to settle over the room like a blanket. Jessica looked up first, her maternal instincts always finely tuned to the absence of her son's usual babbling and movement. She walked toward the closet, expecting to find Leo playing with hangers or trying to climb onto the luggage rack that most hotel closets contained. What she saw instead made her freeze in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth not in fear, but in absolute astonishment. There, in the far corner of the closet where shadows gathered thick and dark, sat Leo cross-legged on the carpet, and across from him, no more than 2 feet away, was a small bear cub. The cub couldn't have been more than a few months old, its fur a soft brown that looked almost golden in the dim light filtering in from the room behind Jessica. It was pressed against the back wall of the closet, trembling slightly, its dark eyes reflecting the light like 2 perfect circles of worry and confusion. Leo, in his innocent wisdom that adults so often lose, showed no fear whatsoever. He was holding out his stuffed bear toward the real one, making soft cooing sounds that Jessica recognized as the same ones he made when trying to comfort their neighbor's scared puppy. The bear cub's nose twitched, catching the scent of the toy, and it made a small whimpering sound that was heartbreakingly similar to a human child's cry of loneliness. Jessica's mind raced with 1,000 questions and concerns, but her body remained perfectly still, understanding instinctively that any sudden movement might frighten either the cub or her son. She whispered Ethan's name, barely louder than a breath, and she heard his footsteps approach behind her. His sharp intake of breath told her he saw what she saw, and together they stood frozen in that doorway, watching their toddler son attempt to make friends with a wild animal that had somehow found its way into their hotel room closet. The cub shifted slightly, and Jessica's heart jumped, but it only moved to sniff at the offered toy, its small pink tongue darting out to taste the fabric. Leo giggled, that pure sound of delight that only children can make, and he scooted a tiny bit closer, still holding out his bear like a peace offering. The scene was so surreal, so impossible, that for a moment both parents wondered if they were dreaming, if the long drive in the mountain air had somehow affected their perception of reality. But the details were too vivid to be anything but real. The way the cub's fur rippled when it breathed, the slight scratching sound its claws made on the carpet when it adjusted its position, the very real smell of wild animal that was beginning to permeate the closet space. Ethan's hand found Jessica's shoulder, a gentle pressure that asked without words what they should do, and she had no answer for him because nothing in their combined life experience had prepared them for finding a bear cub in their hotel room closet. The mystery of how the cub had gotten there was secondary to the immediate concern of what to do about it. But even as they stood there, both parents found themselves scanning the closet for some explanation. The walls appeared solid, the ceiling showed no signs of entry, and the floor was simply carpet over what they assumed was concrete, given they were on the 3rd floor of the building. Yet here was this impossible visitor, looking as confused and out of place as they felt. The cub made another small sound, somewhere between a whine and a grunt, and Leo responded by setting his stuffed bear down between them and patting the floor beside it, as if inviting the cub to come play. The gesture was so purely human, so filled with the assumption that all creatures wanted friendship and comfort, that Jessica felt tears spring to her eyes. She watched as the cub actually moved forward slightly, its nose working frantically to process all the new scents. Human child, laundry detergent, the faint perfume Jessica wore, the leather of Ethan's wallet that had fallen from his pocket during their entrance. If you're enjoying this incredible story, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more amazing content like this. Your support means everything to us and helps us bring you more fascinating stories from around the world. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Ethan, slowly, carefully, reached for his phone in his pocket, not to take a photo or video as might be expected in our modern age, but to call the front desk because surely someone needed to know about this situation. His movements were deliberate and slow, like he was moving through honey, aware that any sudden action might startle the cub into either fleeing deeper into the closet or, worse, becoming defensive. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, before a pleasant voice answered, and Ethan found himself struggling to find words that wouldn't sound completely insane. How did one explain that there was a bear cub in their closet without sounding like they were either joking or having some kind of breakdown? He settled on simply asking for security to come to their room immediately, that there was a situation that required immediate but calm attention. And his serious tone must have conveyed the urgency because the desk clerk assured him someone would be there within minutes. Those minutes stretched like hours as they maintained their vigil at the closet door, watching Leo and the cub engage in what could only be described as a careful, mutual investigation. The cub had moved forward enough now that it was within touching distance of Leo, though neither child nor animal had made that final contact yet. They seemed to be circling each other metaphorically, if not physically, each trying to understand what the other was without the benefit of shared language or species recognition. Leo babbled something in his toddler speak, a string of syllables that meant nothing to adult ears, but seemed to carry some meaning for him, and amazingly, the cub tilted its head as if listening, as if trying to understand this strange, hairless creature that showed no fear and offered toys instead of threats. The soft knock at their door made all 4 occupants of the room freeze, though for different reasons. Ethan moved quickly but quietly to answer it, finding not just 1 security guard but 3, led by a man whose name tag identified him as Michael Hayes, head of security. Michael was not what Ethan had expected from hotel security. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes that suggested he had seen many strange things in his career and had learned to approach them all with patience rather than alarm. Ethan whispered a quick explanation, watching Michael's eyebrows rise, but seeing no disbelief in his expression, only a kind of interested concern that immediately put Ethan more at ease. Michael motioned for the other guards to stay by the door and followed Ethan to the closet, where Jessica still stood watch over the most unlikely playdate in history. Michael's reaction upon seeing the scene was not what any of them expected. Instead of immediately calling for animal control or trying to remove Leo from danger, he stood perfectly still and observed, his trained eye taking in every detail of the situation. The cub's body language, Leo's complete lack of fear, the way the two seemed to have established some sort of primitive communication that transcended species boundaries. After a long moment, he spoke in a voice so soft it was barely above a whisper, explaining that he had worked in these mountains for 30 years and had seen many interactions between humans and wildlife, but never anything quite like this. The cub, he noted, was very young, probably separated from its mother somehow, and its presence in the closet was indeed a mystery that would need solving. But first and foremost, they needed to ensure everyone's safety without traumatizing either the child or the young bear. The way Michael handled the situation spoke of deep experience and an even deeper respect for the wildlife that shared these mountains with the human visitors who came seeking temporary escape from civilization. He didn't rush, didn't panic, didn't immediately reach for phone or radio to call in reinforcements. Instead, he slowly lowered himself to a crouching position where he could better see into the closet, and he watched as Leo finally made the connection everyone had been both anticipating and fearing. The toddler's small hand reached out and touched the cub's fur, gently, just a brief pat like he would give to a dog or cat. And the cub didn't flinch or pull away, but instead made a small sound that could only be interpreted as curiosity rather than fear or aggression. The moment was so profound in its simplicity that all 4 adults found themselves holding their breath, witnessing something that felt ancient and pure. A connection between 2 young beings who hadn't yet learned that they were supposed to be afraid of each other. The cub sniffed at Leo's hand, its black nose wet and shiny in the dim light. And Leo giggled again, that sound of pure joy that seemed to fill the entire room with something like magic. It was then that Michael noticed something the others had missed in their focus on the immediate situation. There were small scratches on the back wall of the closet, fresh ones that suggested recent activity, and when he looked closer, he could see that one of the panels appeared to be slightly displaced, creating a gap that would be invisible to casual observation, but might be just large enough for a small, determined cub to squeeze through. The discovery of the potential entry point raised more questions than it answered, because what was behind that panel? And how had a bear cub come to be there in the first place? Michael explained quietly that the hotel had been built into the mountain itself in some places, using natural caves and formations as part of its structure. An architectural choice that gave the building its unique character, but also meant that sometimes the boundaries between inside and outside were not as clear as they might appear. It was possible, he suggested, that the cub had been exploring one of these natural spaces, perhaps following its mother or searching for food, and had somehow gotten turned around in the darkness, emerging through this forgotten or damaged panel into the closet where it had been hiding, scared and confused, until Leo had discovered it. The explanation made sense in a logical way, but it didn't diminish the wonder of the moment they were all witnessing. Here was nature accidentally intersecting with human habitation in the most unexpected way possible, and instead of chaos or danger, they were seeing something beautiful and gentle, a reminder that the barriers between wild and civilized were sometimes more fluid than people like to believe. Michael slowly stood and whispered that he needed to check something, asking Ethan and Jessica to keep watching but not to interfere unless absolutely necessary. He disappeared from the room for a moment, and they could hear his quiet footsteps in the hallway, then the sound of a door opening somewhere nearby. While Michael was gone, the scene in the closet continued to evolve in ways that seemed almost choreographed by some unseen director who understood that the best stories were those that unfolded naturally, without force or manipulation. The cub had now moved close enough to Leo that they were sitting side by side, and Leo had draped his small arm over the cub's back in a gesture of possession and protection that was heartbreaking in its innocence. The cub seemed to have accepted this contact, perhaps finding comfort in the warmth and companionship after what must have been a terrifying ordeal of being lost and alone in an alien environment. Jessica found herself thinking about her own childhood, about the books she had read where children befriended wild animals, stories she had always dismissed as fantasy, but which now seemed to be playing out in real life right in front of her eyes. Michael returned with a flashlight and what looked like a small toolkit, and he carefully approached the closet from a different angle, trying to get a better look at the displaced panel without disturbing the two youngsters who had now achieved a state of peaceful coexistence that most diplomats would envy. His investigation was methodical and quiet, and after a few minutes he confirmed what he had suspected. The panel was indeed loose, and behind it was a narrow crawl space that connected to what appeared to be a natural fissure in the rock. The space was too small for an adult bear, but perfect for a curious cub that might have been following an interesting scent or just exploring its environment the way young creatures do. The mystery of the how was solved, but it immediately raised the question of where the cub's mother was, because bear cubs this young rarely strayed far from their protective parents. As if summoned by their collective thoughts, a sound from outside made everyone freeze. It was a low, rumbling call that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the building, a sound that was unmistakably ursine and unmistakably concerned. The cub's head shot up at the sound, its entire body suddenly alert and focused, and it made a small answering cry that was high-pitched and plaintive, the sound of a lost child calling for its mother. The adults exchanged worried glances, because a mother bear searching for her cub was a serious situation that could quickly become dangerous if not handled correctly. Michael immediately but calmly suggested they all move back from the closet, giving the cub space to respond to its mother's call without feeling trapped or threatened by their presence. They retreated to the main area of the room, and Jessica scooped up Leo, who protested at being separated from his new friend, but didn't struggle too much in his mother's familiar arms. Through the large windows that overlooked the forest, they could now see movement among the trees, a large shape that moved with surprising grace through the underbrush, clearly searching for something. The mother bear emerged into the small clearing behind the hotel, and even from 3 stories up, they could see she was impressive, her coat thick and healthy, her movements showing both power and anxiety as she continued to call for her missing cub. The sound was heartbreaking in its maternal worry, a universal language of parental concern that transcended species and touched something deep in every parent watching from the window. Michael was already on his radio, quietly coordinating with his team to ensure that no other guests or staff members ventured outside while the mother bear was so close to the building. He explained that they needed to find a way to reunite mother and cub safely, without putting anyone at risk or causing panic among the other guests. The challenge was complex because the cub was on the third floor, the mother was outside, and there was no simple way to bring them together without potentially creating a dangerous situation. As they discussed options, the cub had emerged from the closet and was now standing by the window. Its small paws pressed against the glass as it looked down at its mother, making increasingly urgent sounds that were answered by equally urgent calls from below. The solution, when it came, was both simple and elegant, a testament to Michael's years of experience dealing with wildlife encounters in this mountain setting. He suggested they create a clear path from the room to the nearest exit that led outside, ensuring no other guests would be in the hallways, and then simply open the doors and let nature take its course. The cub, he reasoned, would follow its mother's calls, and as long as they gave it space and didn't create any obstacles or threats, it should be able to find its way out. It was a plan that required trust in the animal's instincts, and a certain amount of faith that sometimes the best thing humans could do was simply get out of the way and let the natural world sort itself out. The preparation took about 15 minutes, with Michael's team quietly clearing the necessary areas and setting up temporary barriers to keep other guests safe and unaware of the drama unfolding on the third floor. During this time, the interaction between Leo and the cub took another unexpected turn that added another layer of poignancy to an already emotional situation. Leo had toddled over to where the cub stood by the window and had placed his stuffed bear on the floor between them, then sat down and began patting the floor in what was clearly an invitation to play. The cub, torn between its mother's calls and this strange new friendship, seemed genuinely conflicted, looking back and forth between Leo and the window where its mother was now visible pacing anxiously below. When everything was ready, Michael gave the signal, and Ethan slowly opened the door to their room while Jessica held Leo, who was now getting sleepy despite the excitement, his head drooping against her shoulder even as he continued to watch his furry friend. The cub's reaction was immediate. It turned toward the open door, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of the outdoors and, more importantly, the familiar smell of its mother carried on the evening breeze. For a moment, it hesitated at the threshold, looking back at Leo and the stuffed bear that still lay on the floor. And in that hesitation was written the entire story of wild things and their occasional, magical intersection with the human world. Then, with a small sound that might have been goodbye, the cub padded out of the room and into the hallway, its movements becoming more confident as it followed the scent trail and the sound of its mother's increasingly urgent calls. The humans followed at a safe distance, watching as the cub navigated the hallway with surprising speed, its instincts taking over as it descended the emergency stairs that Michael's team had cleared for this purpose. They could hear its claws clicking on the metal steps, a rapid staccato that spoke of urgency and anticipation, and then the sound of the exit door opening as one of Michael's team members, positioned safely out of sight, allowed the cub to pass through into the evening air. From the window in their room, they watched the reunion, and it was everything they might have hoped for, and more. The mother bear's entire demeanor changed the moment she saw her cub emerge from the building, her anxious pacing stopping immediately as the small figure bounded across the grass toward her. They met in the middle of the clearing, and the mother immediately began inspecting her baby, sniffing every inch of it, checking for injuries or signs of distress, her large tongue cleaning the cub's fur in a display of maternal care that was both touching and remarkably familiar to any parent who had ever checked their child for scrapes and bruises after an adventure. The cub seemed to be trying to explain its adventure, making small sounds and gestures that looked almost like storytelling, and the mother bear listened with what could only be described as patience, occasionally huffing or grunting in what might have been disapproval or simply acknowledgement. After several minutes of this reunion ritual, the mother bear gently picked up the cub by the scruff of its neck, the way cats carry their kittens, and began to walk back toward the forest. Just before they disappeared into the trees, the cub turned its head back toward the hotel, and even from 3 stories up, they could see it looking directly at their window, as if saying a final goodbye to its brief human friends. The room fell into a profound silence after the bears disappeared into the darkness of the forest, everyone processing what they had just witnessed in their own way. Leo had fallen asleep in Jessica's arms, his small hand still clutching the stuffed bear that had served as an ambassador between species, and Ethan stood with his arm around both of them, feeling like they had been given a gift that they would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand and appreciate. Michael broke the silence with a soft chuckle, admitting that in 30 years of working in these mountains, he had never seen anything quite like what had just happened, and he doubted he ever would again. They talked for a while about the experience, about the mysteries that still remained, like how long the cub had been in that closet before Leo found it, and whether it had been trying to find its way back out or had simply given up and hidden in the darkest corner it could find. Michael shared stories of other wildlife encounters at the hotel, though none as intimate or unusual as this one, and he praised their calm handling of the situation, especially their trust in allowing the reunion to happen naturally, rather than insisting on involving authorities who might have complicated things with tranquilizers and cages and protocols designed more for human comfort than animal welfare. As Michael prepared to leave, he mentioned that the maintenance panel would be properly secured to prevent any future unauthorized visitors, though he said it with a hint of regret, as if closing off this accidental portal between worlds was somehow a loss rather than a necessity. He also suggested, with a knowing smile, that they might want to keep this story relatively quiet, not because there was anything wrong with what had happened, but because sometimes the most magical experiences were cheapened by too much attention and analysis. Some things, he said, were meant to be held close and treasured, rather than shared with a world that might not understand or appreciate the wonder of what had occurred. The next morning brought a different quality of light to their room, and with it a sense that something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of the world and their place in it. Leo woke asking for bear, which they initially thought meant his stuffed animal until he toddled to the closet and looked inside, clearly expecting to find his friend from the night before. Jessica and Ethan took turns explaining, in terms a toddler might understand, that the bear had gone home to its mommy, just like Leo would go home with them when their vacation was over. This seemed to satisfy him, though he spent several more minutes examining the closet, perhaps looking for evidence of his friend's visit, or simply trying to recapture some of the magic from the night before. They spent the rest of their stay at the Whispering Pines Lodge in a state of heightened awareness, noticing things they might have overlooked before. The way the building really did seem to grow from the mountain itself. The occasional scratch marks on trees that suggested the regular passage of bears and other wildlife. The way the staff spoke about the forest with a respect that bordered on reverence. They saw Michael several more times during their stay, and each time he would give them a small nod and a smile that acknowledged their shared secret, their membership in an exclusive club of people who had experienced something extraordinary and had the wisdom to recognize it as such. On their last evening at the lodge, they stood on their balcony watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, and Ethan found himself thinking about boundaries and how artificial most of them were. The line between wild and tame, between human space and animal space, between possible and impossible, all seemed less definite after their experience with the cub. Jessica seemed to be thinking similar thoughts, because she mentioned how the cub had seemed just as curious about them as they were about it, how it had been willing to accept Leo's offer of friendship despite all the evolutionary programming that should have made it fearful of humans. They talked about what they would tell people when they got home, knowing that most would think they were exaggerating or even making the whole thing up. They decided they didn't care about being believed. The experience was theirs, and Leo's, even if he might not remember it clearly as he grew older. They would have the photos they had taken of the room, the closet, the view from their window. But significantly, they had chosen not to photograph the actual encounter, understanding instinctively that some moments were too precious to be reduced to pixels on a screen. The memory would live in their minds and hearts, growing richer with each retelling, becoming part of their family mythology, the story of the time Leo made friends with a bear. As they packed their belongings the next morning, Leo insisted on leaving his stuffed bear in the closet, and no amount of explanation could convince him otherwise. He seemed to believe that another bear might need it, might be scared and alone and in need of comfort, and his parents finally relented, touched by their son's generous spirit. They placed the well-loved toy in the corner where they had first seen the cub, and Leo patted it goodbye with the solemnity of a child performing an important ritual. It was a gesture of faith in the continuing magic of the world, a belief that extraordinary things could happen again if you left room for them, if you were willing to offer friendship to the unexpected and the wild. The drive home was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts, processing the experience in their own way. The mountains receded in the rearview mirror, but the feeling of connection to something larger than themselves remained. They had been given a glimpse into a world that existed parallel to their own, a world where the boundaries they took for granted were more permeable than they appeared, where a child's innocent gesture of friendship could bridge the gap between species, where a mother's love looked the same, whether she walked on 2 legs or 4. It was a reminder that mystery and wonder still existed in the world, that not everything could be explained or categorized or made safe and predictable. Weeks later, back in their suburban home with its fenced yard and domesticated neighborhood, they would sometimes catch themselves looking at shadows in corners, wondering if they might hide something unexpected and magical. Leo developed a fascination with bears that went beyond the usual toddler interest in animals, and his parents indulged him with books and documentaries, watching his face light up with recognition whenever he saw cubs playing or mothers caring for their young. They never knew if he truly remembered that night, or if the story they told him had become his memory, but it didn't matter. The important thing was that he grew up knowing that the world was full of wonders, that friendship could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the best response to the mysterious and wild was not fear, but an open heart and an offered hand. The Whispering Pines Lodge sent them a letter a few months later, a brief note from Michael Hayes informing them that the maintenance panel had indeed been properly secured, but that he had personally made sure Leo's stuffed bear had been preserved and placed in a small display case in the lodge's private collection of memorable moments from the hotel's history. He included a photo of the display, which showed the bear along with a small placard that simply read, "A gift of friendship, room 307. He also mentioned that the mother bear and her cub had been spotted several times in the area, both healthy and thriving, and that the staff had taken to calling the cub Leo in honor of their brief but memorable guest. This news brought tears to Jessica's eyes and a smile to Ethan's face, and they immediately showed the photo to Leo, who studied it with the serious concentration he brought to all important matters. He seemed satisfied that his bear had found a good home, and he asked if they could go back to visit it someday. His parents promised they would, knowing that return visits rarely recaptured the magic of first encounters, but understanding that the journey itself, the act of seeking wonder and remaining open to possibility, was perhaps the real gift their son had given them that night when he sat down with a wild creature and offered it his favorite toy. Years would pass, and the story would be told and retold at family gatherings, each telling adding small details or emphasizing different aspects of that extraordinary night. Sometimes they would wonder if it had really happened exactly as they remembered it, if memory had enhanced and embellished the experience until it became more fairy tale than fact. But then they would remember the feeling of standing in that doorway, watching their son and a bear cub discover each other, the weight of witness to something pure and unexpected. And they knew that regardless of the precise details, the heart of the story was true. They had been given a glimpse of the world as it could be, a world where different species could meet in peace and curiosity, where fear could be replaced by wonder, where a child's innocence could create a bridge across the divide between wild and tame. The story became part of who they were as a family, a touchstone they returned to whenever the world seemed too harsh or too ordinary. When Leo grew older and faced the challenges that all children face, his parents would remind him of his courage that night, how he had approached the unknown with an open heart rather than fear. When they themselves felt overwhelmed by the complexities and difficulties of adult life, they would remember standing in that room, witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible but was, and they would find their faith in mystery and magic renewed. The encounter had lasted perhaps an hour in real time, but its effects rippled outward through their lives in ways they could never have predicted. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light was just right and the world seemed to hold its breath between day and night, they would think about that mother bear and her cub, somewhere in the mountains, living their wild lives with no knowledge of the profound impact they had made on a human family. They wondered if the cub ever remembered its adventure in the world of humans, if it ever told its own offspring about the strange, hairless creature that had offered friendship without condition, about the warm, safe space where it had hidden when lost, about the journey back to its mother that had been facilitated by beings it had been taught to fear, but who had instead shown only kindness. The hotel contacted them again the following year, offering them a complimentary stay in the same room, a gesture that touched them deeply, even as they understood that you could never really go back to a moment of magic and expect it to repeat itself. They did return, though, and while there were no bears in closets this time, they found other wonders, the way the morning mist rose from the valleys like the earth breathing, the family of deer that grazed peacefully just beyond their window, the profound silence of the forest at night that was not really silence at all, but a symphony of small sounds that spoke of life continuing its ancient patterns just beyond the edge of human awareness. On that return visit, they met other guests who had their own stories of unexpected encounters with the wild inhabitants of the mountain, though none quite as intimate as theirs. They realized they were part of a larger community of people who had been touched by these experiences, who had been changed by them in subtle but important ways. These were people who understood that the modern world's insistence on separation between human and nature was an illusion, that the boundaries were always more fluid than they appeared, and that sometimes, if you were very lucky and very open, you might be given a glimpse of the connections that still existed, waiting to be acknowledged and honored. The years continued to pass, and Leo grew from a toddler to a child to a young man. But the story of the bear in the closet remained a cornerstone of his understanding of the world. He became someone who approached life with curiosity rather than fear, who looked for connection rather than division, who understood that the most extraordinary experiences often came disguised as ordinary moments until you looked closer and saw the magic hidden within them. He studied biology in college, specializing in wildlife conservation, and while he never said it explicitly, his family knew that his career choice was rooted in that night when he was 18 months old and had sat with a bear cub in a hotel closet, two young creatures recognizing something in each other that transcended the boundaries their species had built. When Leo eventually had children of his own, the story passed to a new generation, though by then it had taken on the quality of family legend, something that might or might not have happened exactly as told, but whose truth lay deeper than mere facts. His children would listen with wide eyes as their grandfather Ethan told them about the night their father had made friends with a bear, and they would ask to see the photo of the stuffed bear in its display case at the hotel, which still sent them every few years to confirm that it remained there, a tangible reminder that extraordinary things had once happened and might happen again. The profound lesson of that night, the one that revealed itself slowly over years of reflection and retelling, was not just about the possibility of connection between species or the magic that could still be found in the modern world. It was about the power of approaching the unknown with an open heart, about the choice to offer friendship rather than fear when confronted with something outside our normal experience. It was about recognizing that the categories and boundaries we use to organize and understand the world are useful but not absolute, that there are always spaces between our definitions where wonder can slip through, if we're willing to see it and accept it. Looking back on that night from the distance of years, Ethan and Jessica understood that they had been given more than just an extraordinary story to tell. They had been given a new way of seeing the world, one that their son had somehow always possessed, but which they had needed to learn through his example. The bear cub in the closet had been a teacher, showing them that the world was far more interconnected and mysterious than their adult minds had allowed them to believe. Leo's response to finding the cub had been the key that unlocked this understanding. Instead of fear, curiosity. Instead of alarm, compassion. Instead of separation, connection. The hotel eventually closed for renovations, and when it reopened, it had been modernized and updated. The old maintenance panels sealed permanently, the wild edges smoothed away in favor of contemporary comfort and safety. But Michael Hayes, now retired, made sure that Leo's stuffed bear was preserved and moved to the local historical society, where it became part of an exhibit on the relationship between humans and wildlife in the mountain region. The placard was updated to tell more of the story, though never all of it, preserving some of the mystery that had always been an essential part of the experience. When the news of the hotel's renovation reached them, the family felt a pang of loss, as if something precious was being erased from the world. But then Leo, now grown, reminded them that the physical space had never been the important part of the story. The magic had not been in the hotel, or the closet, or even the mountains themselves, but in the moment of connection, in the choice to see wonder rather than danger, in the willingness to sit quietly with the unknown and offer it friendship. These things could not be renovated away or modernized out of existence because they lived not in places but in people, in the stories they told, and the ways those stories shaped their understanding of what was possible. The story took on new relevance as the world seemed to grow more divided, more fearful, more insistent on building walls and maintaining separations. When people spoke of the impossibility of bridging differences, of the danger of the other, of the need for stronger boundaries and higher barriers, the family would think of a toddler and a bear cub sitting together in a closet, two young beings who hadn't yet learned that they were supposed to be enemies, who had found in each other a moment of companionship that transcended every rational expectation. It became their private reminder that connection was always possible, that fear was learned rather than inherent, and that sometimes the wisest response to the unknown was the one that came from innocence rather than experience. As this story draws to a close, though the echoes of that night continue to ripple outward through time and memory, what remains most vivid is the image of trust. A small boy's hand reaching out to touch wild fur, a frightened cub accepting comfort from an unexpected source, parents choosing to witness rather than interfere. A security guard recognizing that sometimes the best security comes from allowing nature to follow its own path. Each of these acts of trust had required a suspension of the normal rules, a willingness to believe that the world might be kinder and more connected than fear would have us believe. The final image that the family carried with them was not of the dramatic moment of discovery, or even the touching reunion between mother and cub, but of the quiet aftermath, what they had stood together in their room, looking out at the forest where two bears had disappeared into the darkness, carrying with them a story they could never tell, but which had become part of the larger story of the mountain, of the hotel, of the countless intersections between wild and civilized that happen every day, mostly unnoticed and unrecorded. They had been privileged to witness one of these intersections, to be part of it, to have their lives changed by it in ways both subtle and profound. The truth that emerged from their experience was both simple and revolutionary. The world was still capable of surprise, still held spaces where the impossible became possible, still offered opportunities for connection that transcended the boundaries humans had created to make sense of their existence. All it required was the courage to sit quietly with mystery, to offer friendship to the unknown, to trust that sometimes the best response to finding a bear in your closet was not panic or violence, but patience and wonder, and an open heart. This was the gift that Leo had given not just to the frightened cub, but to everyone who witnessed or heard about that extraordinary night when the wild came calling, and was met not with fear, but with a child's simple offer of friendship and a well-loved toy. In the end, the story was not really about bears or hotels, or even the mystery of how a cub came to be in a closet on the 3rd floor of a mountain lodge. It was about the possibility that still existed in the world for magic and wonder, for connections that defied explanation, for moments when the ordinary became extraordinary simply because someone was willing to see it that way. It was about the choice, always available but rarely taken, to approach the unknown with curiosity rather than fear, to offer kindness rather than suspicion, to trust that the world might be more beautiful and interconnected than we dared to believe. The family never saw the bears again, never had another encounter quite like that one, but they didn't need to. Once you had been shown that such things were possible, once you had witnessed the dissolution of boundaries you had thought were absolute, once you had seen your child teach you through his innocence that fear was a choice rather than a requirement, you carried that knowledge with you always. It changed the way you moved through the world, the way you responded to the unexpected, the way you told stories and raised children, and faced the unknown territories that life inevitably presented. And so the story ends where it began, with the family seeking a simple vacation in the mountains, and finding instead a profound reminder of the mystery and wonder that still existed in the world. They had gone looking for rest and relaxation, and had found instead a story that would define them, shape them, and inspire them for the rest of their lives. They had discovered that sometimes the most extraordinary adventures came not from seeking them, but from being open to them when they appeared, uninvited and unexpected, like a bear cub in a hotel closet, waiting to teach anyone willing to learn that the world was far more magical than most people dared to believe. The lasting impact of that night was not measured in the story itself, remarkable as it was, but in the way it changed how they approached every day that followed. They became people who looked for wonder in ordinary places, who expected magic to reveal itself in unexpected ways, who taught their children and grandchildren that the appropriate response to mystery was not fear, but fascination. They became keepers of a secret that was not really secret at all, but simply overlooked by most, that the world was alive with possibility, that connections existed everywhere waiting to be acknowledged, and that sometimes all it took to touch the extraordinary was the courage to sit quietly with the unknown and offer it your favorite toy. This is the story they carried with them, the story that became part of their family's DNA, passed down not just in words, but in attitudes and approaches to life. It was the story of how a frightened bear cub and a fearless toddler had shown them that the boundaries between worlds were more permeable than they appeared, that kindness could bridge any gap, and that wonder was always available to those who remembered how to see with the eyes of a child. It was a story that grew richer with each telling, not because details were added or embellished, but because each telling reminded them of the truth at its heart, that they lived in a world where magic was not only possible, but present, waiting in closets and forests and the spaces between what we know and what we're willing to discover.